Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Zeus and Hera Show, starring Tony Mierzwicki and produced by myself, Susan Duncan. We are so delighted to have the next guest on the show. But first, for the disclaimer, the views expressed on this particular podcast are for informational purposes only and may not necessarily be that of Tony or the management. Now to introduce Tony. Tony is the author of two fabulous books. The first one is Greco-Egyptian Magic, and the second one is Hellenismos. We highly recommend that you get them if you don't already. And now, Tony, let me go ahead and get you into the frame. How are you today, Tony? Can you see us?
Yes, I can. I'm doing really well today, Susan, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Today, we're very pleased to have Darren Lorente-Bull on the show to talk about his book, Searching for the Divine Spark, A Brief History of Gnosticism. I actually reviewed this book on my Pathos blog, Holistic Spirituality, in April 2024, and wanted to learn a little bit more about it. But first, let's have a look at Darren's background. Darren Lorente-Bull has written a number of books on Freemasonry and various esoteric subjects. So there was More Light, Today's Freemasonry for Men and Women, written in 2017 with Julian Rees. The Other Brotherhood, When Freemasonry Crossed the English Channel, published by Masonica S in 2017, as well as La Ordo Templis Orientis Telema in Spanish, and other books. I hope I haven't bastardized the pronunciation. Hope my pronunciation wasn't too bad. Okay, thanks. So Darren was initiated into Freemasonry in 2006 and is currently a member of the International Order of Freemasonry for Men and Women, Les Droits Humains. Darren, thank you so much for making yourself available and coming on the show. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute privilege. Thank you.
We're absolutely thrilled to have you on the show. And actually, you're our first guest to have written a book on Gnosticism. So baby steps for the sake of our listeners, for the benefit of our listeners who aren't familiar with Gnosticism, could you give us a brief summary of what it is?
Well, it's a very complex subject matter, but I think for the purpose of summarizing it and providing an easy definition, the root of the word Gnosticism, gnosis, is a Greek word which means knowledge. Knowledge as in experiential knowledge. So, the knowledge you acquire through tasting wine rather than reading about wine, for example. So, and this is a whole movement that was prevalent in the ancient world in the first 3-4 centuries of our era. There's also obviously an argument that Gnosticism existed before that, during the early days of Judaism. Some of the more ascetic sects of Judaism, like the Essenes, were Gnostics. And Gnosticism is really it's a movement that's something between religion, philosophy. It offers a whole worldview, a whole cosmogony of a world that's fallen, pretty much like in Christianity, but with a big difference that this fall has been caused through a completely different set of events. There's no sin, there's no redemption involved, there's no disobedience. It's rather a Platonic view of creation, where there's a primordial God, and he generates copies which are emanations of himself through these mystical couples, these units of space and time called eons, and one of them generates by mistake a false god. That's one of the main components of Gnosticism, is the idea that there's a false god that rules over this physical realm that we all inhabit as humans. And this kind of explains, or I think quite well, the problem of evil, which lots of mainstream religions struggle big time with. So Gnosticism is about acquiring through this special knowledge that you can acquire of God. You then realize that you're inhabiting a false reality, a false world, and you want to you want to get to understand and know who the true God is. So you know your place in the whole cosmological hierarchy. So yes, it's a quite complex, and of course there's elements of mystical Judaism, there's elements of Hellenism, Platonism, Middle Platonism, the ancient mysteries, and of course the early Christianity. I think is a very important addition. I think I think Gnosticism throughout the ages has managed to adapt itself and integrate with other religions like Islam, Judaism before that, obviously. But Christianity, I think, is where it's most it's merged really well in a sense, or it's really and that's why these gospels, these Gnostic gospels, are feature Christ and Mary and lots of the characters that we see in the canonic gospels, but of course with a completely different twist. So yes, I mean it's a kind of bit of a minefield, but Gnosticism is something that's halfway between a religion and a philosophy, that's trying to help us understand who the real God is and to transcend the limits of this physical world. There's different elements, varying degrees of dualism depending on each Gnostic group. So some of them will say that this world is a complete abomination and it's a horrible place, and it's a very dark sort of perspective. And other schools are not so much. So as I say, varying degrees. But that's, I would say, a bit of a roundabout way. But I think that's how I would describe Gnosticism.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that Gnosticism actually refers to experiential knowledge rather than book knowledge. But there was one thing that jumped out at me. You talked about the Gnostic influence in early Judaism, and you mentioned the Essenes as one of the groups that had Gnostic influences. Now, the Essenes were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So can we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls as having Gnostic influences in them? And if so, I'm going to have to look at them again in a totally different manner.
I believe so, and again, something I need to, I need to make very clear is that I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, so I'm just an average writer trying to make some sense of what Gnosticism is, history, background, influences, and so on. But yes, I mean the Essenes are responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also, it's all these, it's a very interesting idea, because of course the Essenes were ascetic Jews that went to the desert and were very indulging in, well, not indulging, on the contrary, they were submitting to ascetical practices and mysticism and looking for the deeper meaning and of their religion, and they were quite radical in that sense. But it's then not very long after that, with the advent of Christianity, and after Christianity has been assimilated by the Roman Empire and occupy that vacuum, when there's no longer, when Christians are no longer persecuted, that many Christians, not many, but quite a few, decide to go to the desert and behave in the very same way as the Essenes, following these mystical practices, these ascetic practices, fasting, meditation, contemplation, the repetition of Christian mantras, which I know is not a very good word to use, but it's the best I can come, about with, hesychasm and so on and so forth. So yes, I would say that, and of course the Dead Sea Scrolls were found near, if I'm not mistaken, near an old monastery as well of, so they were preserved, so they were written or partly written by the Essenes, but also preserved by Christian monks, early Christian monks. These early I believe that's the case with the Nag Hammadi as well. I think that some of these codices were found in some of these remnants of old Christian groups, ascetic mystical groups that were in the desert.
Yeah, when you talked about monks going out into the desert, I found myself thinking of the Desert Fathers tradition
That's
within
right.
the
That's right.
Orthodox Church. So that's very much in keeping with those. I'm going to disagree with you about one thing. You write like a scholar. You may say you're not a scholar, but your writing is so well researched, and you're such a critical thinker. You know, I think of you as a scholar. So I'm
Well,
going to
that's
have
very
to
kind of you.
respect.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to respectfully
That's a very
disagree with
nice.
you.
That's very so kind, Tony. Thank you. Thank you. You see, obviously, when you look at the people that have written about these, you know, Elaine Pagels, you know, Mervyn Mayer, April DeConnick, Hans Jonas, Tobias Churton. You know, these are all, you know, really serious academics that have dedicated their part of their lives, their academic lives to the study of Gnosticism, and of course, they have lots of things to say. But I think, yeah, I think my book is hopefully give an idea. It's accessible. I hope it is accessible, and I hope that people will enjoy it, and that will maybe lead them to read the you know, the big guys after that. You know, so yeah.
I see it as a wonderful introduction. You covered a whole lot of material, not just on Gnosticism itself, you know, classical Gnosticism, but what Gnosticism developed into, and then you came up with ideas of what the future of Gnosticism might be. But we'll get to that later on in the interview. In the title of your book, you refer to the divine spark. So I was wondering if you could explain to our viewers what the divine spark is exactly and how it ties in with Gnosticism.
Well, I think that the divine spark is a very convenient. I mean, it's perfect for a book title. I mean, it really has got this. The thing about the divine spark is it's something. I think it's an idea, a notion that we find in many different religions, and I think in Gnosticism, I'm not sure. I have to be honest. I'm not sure that it's actually written exactly like that in any of the Gnostic Gospels. But I think that in the Origin of the World and a couple of others, there's it's implied, or there's a talk about this when these Gnostic Gospels are talking about the genesis of the world. They're talking about how these emanations, these copies from the original God, end up with this kind of cosmic error, this accident where one of the eons, one of these units of space and time, Sophia, wisdom, begets the false god called Yaldabaoth or the DemiUrge, Saklas, lots of different names in different Gnostic Gospels. And so basically this false god, through his own servants called archons, which are, I suppose we could, an easy way to try and describe them would be as demons of some sort. They actually create our own body parts. So there's an archon that creates. So each one of our body parts, physical body parts, is created by a different archon. So it basically is a very Platonic idea in a way. You know, this big division between, you know, the physical realm full of copies, and then the origin, the ideal realm, the pleroma, as the Gnostics call it. So sorry. So to go back to the divine spark, the divine spark is, since we're all copies of copies of copies of copies, we still preserve that divine spark, that little spark of light that comes from the real God within us. And that's our hope to attain salvation, if that's the right word or the right term to use within the Gnostic context. So yes, it's a very, I think it's a very convenient. I like it very much because I think it's the most sort of hopeful you know, term within all this Gnostic terminology, because you've got, which can be very dark, especially the more dualists, where they'll say that you know, that this whole world is an abomination, and you know, so we've got this divine spark that we can still, which is within us. So and I think this is picked up later on as well by different esoteric traditions in the West. I mean, in Freemasonry, for example, we don't talk about the divine spark, but we do talk about self-construction, building the temple within. So I think these are ideas that are very esoteric and that are very malleable, and you know, we can use in lots of different contexts. And I think that and I think it does describe well the essence of Gnosticism, in my humble opinion.
Mhm. Throughout your book, you referred to the Gnostic religion by Hans Jonas. I was actually gifted this book when I was just 19 years old by a guy
Well,
from the Sydney University gym when I trained in. It was my introduction to Gnosticism. Makes me really happy that so much of it is still relevant.
definitely. I mean, and I think that if you look at the at the end of the 19th century, philosophers like G.R. Mead and a few others, I don't remember their names, unfortunately, they wrote lots of books on Gnosticism. Some old codices had been found in different parts, I think in Egypt, but nothing anywhere near as important or valuable as the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi codices. But so you had G.R. Mead, which he's got a book on, I think it's called Fragments of an Ancient Religion. I think it's the title of his books from the late 19th century. I think I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected, but I think that's his book. So between Mead and all the latest authors I've mentioned before, you know, Elaine Pagels, Gilles Gispel, Mayer, De Koning, etc., all these fairly recent, Hans Jonas is the only person, the only scholar or academic within the 20th century that picks it up. And it is amazing that he would do such a thing. It just seems so, because he was interested in Gnosticism, and he was also interested in, he was an early environmentalist as well, in a way. So he's a fascinating character, a student of Heidegger, who then joins the Nazi party, and then Hans Jonas decides, you know, disowns him as a mentor and leaves. And I think that the Hans Jonas's book, which I haven't read the whole book, I read some chapters, and I used some of the parts of the book that were relevant to my own personal study. And I think Hans Jonas' perspective is, and this is one of the things about Gnosticism, that it lends itself to so many different perspectives. Hans Jonas' perspective is an existentialist one. I mean, this is, you know, he's written shortly after or during the Second World War. And it just comes, it's that milieu of you know, this kind of huge disappointment in the world, and in the, you know, the living in a world that's completely unbalanced and in disharmony, where, you know, well, all the horrible tragedy of the war. And of course, you know, I think Hans Jonas looks at Gnosticism as a way to explain this, as a way of saying, you know, look, this is the Gnostics already talked to us about this. You know, the world is hopeless in a way. You know, it's kind of a meaningless world in a way, because I mean, that's one of the things with Gnosticism, taken to its extremes. It's a very dark alley. It's a very you know, hopeless path. And I think that's what Hans Jonas kind of brings out in his book, which but it's fascinating that somebody like him, and I say, you know, it's got nothing to do with what Heidegger's philosophy or any of the, you know, interests of people of that age. So I think Hans Jonas is a very very unique in his interests. You know, write something like that at that period, you know, really interesting.
The GRS Mead book that you were thinking of is Fragments of a Faith Forgotten. One thing in was Fragments of a Faith Forgotten.
Yes,
that was a book, but it's like, it's that thick.
yes.
I've never actually owned that book. I've only got excerpts out of it, but it's an absolutely amazing text. It's probably available freely online these days because it's well out of copyright. One of the things in the Hans Jonas book that stuck with me forever was this idea of the divine spark coming in from the Ogdo, you know, the realm outside the planets, coming in and acquiring planetary accretions, and that would explain differences in personality with different people. So we'd have different planetary amounts. So I might have more Saturn energy than you. You might have more Jupiter energy than me, and that sort of explains our differences. And I've had that image with me like since I was 19. I've carried it with me, and you know, ascending up the tree of life and all that, you basically peeling off those planetary accretions to see what you are within, the divine spark. It ties in perfectly with Kabbalistic ascension and everything else. It's really valuable knowledge to have.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and as I say, it just seems something completely unusual for somebody like Hans Jonas at that time in history, given the fact that Heidegger and and all the German philosophy of the time, it really is something quite novel that he would go in that direction. So yeah, it is very, very interesting.
Yeah. In your book, you wrote that Hellenic classical philosophy was an important influence on Gnosticism, and you gave the example of Plato's myth of the cave. I was wondering if you could walk us through this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, Platonism or Middle Platonism or Platonism in any of its guises, I think is definitely a very important influence. And this is to say, of course, that Plato has nothing to do with Gnosticism, and his, I don't, obviously he's a philosopher, a Greek philosopher of his time, and has nothing to do with Gnosticism per se, but I think that his work definitely influenced many of these Gnostic teachers and practitioners of the ancient, the first 3-4 centuries of our era. And I think that with the myth of the cave is basically Plato's way of giving us a kind of a allegory or myth with which he wants to explain the nuts and bolts of his philosophy, the theory of ideas, which is what I've made reference to this before. There's some sort of Platonic mold in another realm, in a heavenly realm, where you've got where the perfect the perfect glass exists, and that glass is up there. It's perfect. It cannot be improved upon. It's the glass of all glasses. All the glasses that we see here are nothing more than mere copies of this, and then of course Plato stops there. I mean, and that's basically the theory of your ideas, where he tries to explain the difference between the spiritual and the material. The Gnostics take it a step further. But going back to the myth of the cave, we've got the myth is basically a group of slaves that have been chained facing a wall of the cave with a big bonfire behind them, and all they've ever seen for all the first years of their existence is the shadows of the people and the things that are happening before. One of the slaves escapes, manages to realize that, and then realizes that, of course, all he and his companions have been seeing are reflections, a false reality. Now, I don't think that Plato was trying to say with that the material world is doomed and it's a place of, which is completely a complete fake, a complete false world. But I think that the Gnostics would have maybe seen that there, would have interpreted in that way, would have seen that as an extreme case of dualism, and they would have say, right, this is we are like these slaves, we're chained in this cave. But of course, for the Gnostics, we are chained by the false god, be it Yaldabaoth or the DemiUrge or Saklas or whatever name the different gospel will give this false god, and we're then prisoners of this lack of gnosis. And of course, when this slave escapes and realizes he's just been observing the reflections of the shadows caused by this bonfire, he then attains knowledge of that. But for the Gnostics, that would have been Gnostic knowledge, and I think that's why I see the myth of the cave. I think is very it's a very, very apt and easy way to understand Gnostic cosmology. I think if somebody, if I met somebody tomorrow morning and said, look, I have no idea what Gnosticism is, what is it, please, what's it all about, I would talk to them about the myth of the cave. I would intimate, of course, that neither Plato or the myth of the cave have got nothing to do with Gnosticism, but they do explain very well this idea, the idea of that the Gnostics have of this, of the material world being delusional, being a total delusion, and that consciousness and ideas and the spiritual realm is what really matters.
Another way of explaining Gnosticism is to refer people to the first Matrix movie where Neo gets the red pill, and all of a sudden he breaks into reality from the illusion that was created by this advanced computer system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, the Matrix is even more apt. Of course, it's um, the fact that these artificial intelligences are feeding all these human bodies they're using as batteries to power
Yeah.
themselves, and they're feeding them all these really sophisticated false lives where they all have all the things and they can actually bribe them, don't they, with if they decide to betray their companions in the saga, then they can. There's this famous scene where one of the guys that betrays Neo, I think, says, "Oh, he's eating a steak," and he says, "I know it's not real, but it tastes fantastic," or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, of course. I mean, I think the Matrix is definitely the Gnostic film and the Gnostic analogy per se. But if we will try to go back to the influences of early Gnosticism and the milieu and all the ideas that were floating about, I think Platonism and its subsequent guises like Middle Platonism, I think are very, very important. And a good way to explain it as well.
A few minutes ago, you were talking about the DemiUrge, and I know from my own reading that Gnostic writings contain numerous references to the DemiUrge. So I was wondering what the origin of that term was, and how was it understood by the various Gnostic schools?
So I think, well, with the word is demiurgos in Greek, which I believe means craftsman or maker, engineer, or well, maybe not engineer. I mean, they were engineers then, but yes, a builder or a maker. And I think that and again, this is the origin of the term as taken out of the day-to-day language is Plato again. I think it's the Timaeus or the Banquet or one of these dialogues where he introduces the word demiurge as not as something evil, not as something neither evil, neither or good or benign, as a kind of cosmic motor that makes the cosmos work, as a kind of cosmic engine. And that's the Platonic understanding of the term. But of course, for the Gnostics, for I think basically all of them, they give the demiurge different names, but it's an evil entity. It's an evil entity to some extent. I mean, I think the Valentinians perhaps are not so adamant, but for most of them, yes, it's the most typical name the Gnostics give the demiurge is Yaldabaoth, which I don't know where that originates from. I mean, obviously it's in the Gospels, in the Gnostic Gospels, in the codices, but I'm not sure what the etymological origin of the word would be. But this is a being that's been created by error. All these emanations, all these eons that the real primordial God sends down have to they operate in pairs called sixties, pairs of male and female, and then they beget the next one down. But Sophia decides to do it by herself without her cosmic consort, and then she produces this abomination called Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, who's this false god. It's quite a negative, and it's at the key. It's at the it's the key element in Gnostic cosmology and philosophy. This false god that has created this false world, and it's through him that evil is explained. The problem of theodicy, which, as I said before, I mean. Most religions or most mainstream religions can't explain it. It's a big struggle. I was watching a documentary today with Bishop Barron. I think he's quite interesting to watch sometimes, and they're doing a really good job of explaining the problem of evil. But at the end, he gave up, sort of thing, and he says, "Satisfied? No. Well, good." That's what he said to his views. He could not. There's no way to explain it other than by saying that God works in mysterious ways. And with the Gnostics is very clear. They say, well, no, it's this is an imperfect world because it's been created by an imperfect God. What we need to do is transcend this world and get to know and understand where the real God is, and then we will be in this, in the pleroma, which is the fullness, where again, I mean, it's tempting to and again, this realm, the physical realm where we all live. This is the kenoma, the emptiness. So, you know, and I suppose it's empty of gnosis, whereas the Paroma is full of gnosis. But yeah, so the demiurge is a Platonic, again, a Platonic term that's used without any sort of prejudice, but that the Gnostics then cling on to and think, right, this is good. This is what we call the false god. Of course, some of the Gnostic schools would look at the Old Testament God, Yahweh from the Old Testament, as being the demiurge. You know, that kind of, and of course they can easily find lots of examples in that sort of God of fire and brimstone. You know, so the God of the Old Testament and the God of Paul are obviously very different. So, and of course, Paul is considered the kind of proto-Gnostic, as Elaine Page was very nicely explains in her book. But yeah, the demiurge, I would say, is generally speaking, for most Gnostics, all of them really, is a negative presence, a negative entity, a false god.
The Gnostic idea of painting the Old Testament God as the demiurge and being inherently evil, and different to the New Testament God, who's a God of love, has always made so much sense to me. So you go through the Old Testament, and the Old Testament God is a particularly bloodthirsty God. He told the Israelites to go into a particular land, slay every man, woman, and child, even their animals, and if there are any babies, they'd smash them against the rocks. Every sort of murder, every murderous incident that happens because of him. I don't think Satan's responsible or Sataniel was responsible for any of the deaths. Whereas you look at the God of the New Testament, he's a God of compassion, a God of love, more a God that I could resonate with. So it was one of the reasons why so many of the Gnostics ran foul of the early church.
Absolutely, absolutely. But then again, on the other hand, if you look at you know, Valentinus was going to be a bishop in the mainstream emerging Christian church. Basilides, who's always associated with Abraxas and with magical practices inherited from Egypt, he also apparently defined himself as a Christian. Marcion is more a cut case probably because he summarized, I think it's the Gospel of Luke or Matthew, I'm not sure, but he summarized one of the canonical Gospels and was perhaps more akin to you know, Orthodox Christianity, but still considered a Gnostic. So many, but and even people like you know, fathers of the church like Origen and Clement of Alexandria, they wrote against the Gnostics and definitely would not want to be called Gnostics. But many of their ideas were you know, completely unorthodox. I mean, I think it was Origen who believes that in reincarnation. It was Clement who was excommunicated, I believe, as well, because he said that everybody would be saved, even Satan. They believe that there's past worlds and there will be new worlds, and you know, very different set of ideas than we would find in Orthodox Christianity. So yeah, of course. But then again, the New Testament also comes into conflict in some of the Nag Hammadi codices. Some of the Gospels, they talk again, you know, obviously they don't believe that Christ was crucified. They don't believe, you know, you've got Mary, possibly Mary Magdalene, very possibly. I mean, you know, nothing can be proved, I believe, but she becomes the most important disciple, not Peter, in these Gnostic Gospels. So Gnosticism and its interaction with Christianity does tend to you know, go against the grain in, you know, be it the Old Testament and the New Testament. But of course, it's interesting how they see this Old Testament God, this fire and brimstone Old Testament God, bloodthirsty, as you say, being the demiurge. You know, that makes perfect sense, definitely.
Regular listeners are very familiar with Neoplatonism. How does this compare with Gnosticism, in your opinion?
Well, there's all these there's these links with I think it was Plotinus, or was it Philo of Alexandria? I get confused sometimes. Who was apparently a disciple of Ammonius of Succus, the same as Origen, who, as I said before, had some Gnostic leanings, even though, despite of himself not wanting to admit that, I would imagine. But I think that obviously the Platonic origin of Neoplatonism, the bread and butter concepts of Platonism, the DemiUrge, the theory of ideas, the notion of copies, all very similar to the notion of emanations. But I think that Neoplatonism doesn't lead us to this dark alley, doesn't see the world as being something you know, horrible and dark and false, and you know, we're focusing on the suffering and so on. So I think that Neoplatonism is more it will then lead us on to in the Renaissance through medieval Hermeticism. I think it's much closer to Hermeticism in this belief of you know, of a harmonious universe in a way, whereas Gnosticism is not offering us a harmonious, balanced universe, rather a very dark one. So I think there's loads of ideas that are similar, but ultimately they differ in a big way. And I think that Neoplatonism leads us into Hermeticism, and I think that Gnosticism, well, I mean, and it's not a direct linear tradition, but I think Gnosticism you'll find in many occult traditions. And now, you know, I'm not going to debate if this is true Gnosticism or not, but if you read, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with Chaos Magic and Peter J. Carroll. Yeah. Of course, he talks about Gnosis in his book Liber Null, and he talks about the, you know, acquiring a Gnostic state, and he doesn't talk a lot, and he sees himself as being a bit of a heir to the Gnostics. Now, you know, why not? Maybe it's perfectly reasonable. He makes sense in what he says. So, but I think it's I think Gnosticism, it tends to go more towards the more occult and more fringe ideas in esotericism, whereas Neoplatonism takes us to Hermeticism, which is a more sort of solar and positive and bright outlook.
I've read about the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices, and compared to the gory account that you give, they've all been very kind of fluffy and Disney-like. Yours was particularly gory, like I said. I was wondering if you could walk us through it.
Yes, of course. So the Nag Hammadi codices were found in Egypt in 1945, and what we've got is this Arab peasant and his brothers. They're looking for a fertilizer to, you know, for their crops. So they're looking in these old caves, and they come across this massive set of jars, very ancient. They open them, they with their tools, and of course, some of the papyrus is so old that it turns into dust and kind of glitters. So they think a jinn's going to appear, and they get scared. Bearing in mind this is 1945. The main character here is this Arab peasant farmer called Mohammed Ali Saman, who then finds these codices and thinks, right, this is looks like Christian stuff to me. So he tries to sell it to some dealers in Cairo, and his mother uses it to you know, for the chimney, which is some of them. It's awful, isn't it? But of course, it's strange. And going back to what we're talking about, this dark and side of Gnosticism, this occult. It seems that even in its inception, when it really comes to life as an idea in the Western mind, Gnosticism, with the discovery of these codices, this Mohammed Saman, he's just, his father's been killed by accident by I believe another farmer. So his brother and him kill this man and eat his heart, which is just bizarre, isn't it? And this is the guy that finds the codices, and he goes to prison, and then when he comes out of prison, all the codices that his mother still hasn't used to light the chimney with. He then manages to flog to some art dealer in Cairo, I believe, and then it ends up in the hands of a Western scholar, Gilles Gispel, who understands the significance of these codices. And the thing with this is that this can all be seen. I'm not sure if you've seen it. If you go on YouTube, there's a series from 1986 that was made by Channel 4 by Tobias Churton called The Gnostics, and it's in four parts. And Gilles Gispel, Gilles Quispel, actually meets Mohammed Saman when they're both very old, and there's footage of both of them. They're shaking hands in that documentary. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's definitely worth a watch. There's it walks us through all the different historical stages of Gnosticism. But yeah, you can actually see both of them meeting, and Gilles Gispel telling him, Gilles Gispel, sorry, always get confused. Telling Mohammed Saman, oh, you might not know this, but your discovery, your accidental discovery, has changed the world. So it's quite, yeah, it is definitely, and it's strange, isn't it, that you would have this sort of blood curdling story at the heart of it, you know, cannibalism, you know, it's weird, to say the least.
So what do you see as the significance of the Nag Hammadi codices?
They, I mean, I think in a nutshell, they supplement lots of the old codices and manuscripts and papyruses that have been discovered previously, and they fulfill them. And there's, you know, full texts. They, but they yes, they allow us to have a much better understanding of what Gnosticism was, or what we now call Gnosticism, because of course, excuse me, Elaine Pagels now says that there isn't such a thing as Gnosticism. It was all ancient Christianity in its different guises. But I think it gives us a really good understanding of what Gnosticism is, what we call Gnosticism, and what Christianity was, and how Christianity wasn't a monolith. How Christianity was very divided and fragmented, and there were lots of very different groups and ideas, and there were lots of different mixing loads of different ideas and currents from the time. So I think that's one of the most important things, that and for me personally, the Nag Hammadi gives us this idea that you know, that we can understand the spiritual side of Christianity without having to adhere to all these dogmas that you know, that because of course they break down loads of the dogmas themselves, these ancient texts, and also they provide us with you know, the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, why wasn't that ever included in the canon? Why? I mean, you know, it would have been an absolutely beautiful gospel to include in the canon, and it would have been, I think it talks to us. I think it talks to contemporary Westerners and Christians in general. I think if they picked it up, than many of the synoptic gospels, I think. So I think it's just given us a more diverse and varied understanding of what these movements really were, and how, you know, all these dogmas, like, you know, the Holy Trinity was something that was created in I think it's the 4th century in one of the conciliums. So yeah, it's given us a new path, in a way, a new path. You know, there are lots of beautifully written, some of them, and very diverse. I mean, you've got the Gospel of Truth, and you've got the Gospel of the Egyptians, you've got theurgy, you've got you know, Hellenism. I believe there's a fragment of the Republic by Plato that was amongst these codices. So it really is a treasure trove of ancient philosophy and mysticism.
I was actually going to ask you about the Gospel of Thomas next, but there was one thing that you said that I wanted to drill down on. You quoted an academic who said that there was no Gnosticism. It was all Christian schools. But you and I both know that while many of the Gnostic schools were perversions of Christianity or developments of Christianity, there are a number of other Gnostic groups that had no Christian influence whatsoever in them. So I think it's an oversimplification. Gnosticism was this huge umbrella term, and not all the Gnostic schools are Christian.
No, of course, and I think I might have interpreted Pagels when she says this, but I have heard her say this in one of read this in one of her books. But I think what she's probably saying is that these Jewish groups that we would refer to as Gnostic, they're just varieties of the Jewish religion. So I think she's because what she says, I think, is that they were only called Gnostics subsequently through the Irenaeus and all the other heresiologists. So I don't think they refer to themselves as Gnostics. They believe they were something else. They did. So it's one of these things where we know them through their enemies. We know them through their we know that initially until of course, going back to your previous question, the Nag Hammadi codices were found, but we knew of them initially through Irenaeus and Hippolytus and all these other Orthodox Christian heresiologists, and they call them Gnostics. But maybe, but again, so I think they see. I think some of these scholars have got a problem with the word Gnostic and with this and describing and being. Because of course I suppose it can then lend itself to lots of we can end up calling lots of things Gnostic as well, maybe. I don't know, it's a two-edged sword.
So you've already briefly alluded to the Gospel of Thomas. It'd have to be the most famous of the Gnostic Gospels, and it was actually extensively featured in a 1999 movie called Stigmata, and that brought the Gospel of Thomas into even greater prominence for the general public. I was wondering what you see as the significance of the Gospel of Thomas. You previously said that it should have been included in the Bible, but it wasn't. If you could just explain your thoughts on the significance of it, that'd be great.
Well, I know that many scholars will say that they do not consider it the Gnostic Gospel. Because, of course, there's no references to Sophia, there's no references to emanations, there are no references to the DemiUrge, there's no references to any of all the Gnostic jargon that we find in and ideas that we find in all the other Gnostic Gospels isn't present. These are just it's kind of like a wisdom book, like the Book of Wisdom or the Book of Proverbs. These are just sayings of Christ. They remind me of Japanese koans in a way. They seem to want to transcend the limitations of language and make us have a eureka moment in our mind, when we read them. But there are no Gnostic references per se, although there's a constant underlying reference by Christ, who's the voice of this book, asking us to seek for gnosis or for knowledge. So you've got that on one hand, and then on the other hand, it does. I mean, it does. They say that it doesn't have any Orthodox Christian references, but I think it's saying 55. I think it's 55, where it talks about carrying your cross as a metaphor for enduring pain or discomfort. So it does obviously make some reference to so it seems to me that it's the perfect gospel because it's something that also mainstream Christians and students of the esoteric, people interested in Gnosticism can enjoy equally, and it also has a very practical purpose. I think it really wants to awaken us, and it's by this use of as I say, these riddles. It reminds me of Japanese koans in a way, which if you don't bring forth what's inside you will destroy you, and it has a lot of very educational, spiritual educational, very it wants to teach us to find our inner self. So it's a very deeply spiritual gospel. I think it's I mean, it's the one I best know, the one I've most, and I think most people are aware of. And it's interesting you mentioned that film, because I remember watching that film all those years ago, but I have no recollection of the references to the Gospel of Thomas. So I'm definitely going to be watching that as the first chance I have. I'll enjoy that. So thank you, Tony.
My pleasure. I'm overdue for watching it as well. What was I going to say? Okay, so the Coptic Gospel of the Egyptians in the Nag Hammadi codices contains vow chants reminiscent of those in the Greek magical papyri, and they also occur in other texts such as the Discourse of the 8th and the 9th. What do you think their significance is?
That's for me one of the most interesting questions. Really, are these barbaric names? Are these really the sort of language that you'll find in the Greek papyrus and all these other texts, or are this what kind of what does it mean? Is it glossolalia? Is it a form of has this been written by somebody that's gone into some sort of trance? And then you've got a scribe that's just noting it all down. It really is it's the language that we find in grimoires, magical texts. I really don't know what to think. I mean, it seems to me that it's I mean, if you read it out loud, it really does sound like something that you would find in the OTO or in any of these magical societies of today. So I'm going to ask you, Tony, what do you think?
I've actually thought a lot about it, and I know from investigating the Hermetic writings, the Corpus Hermeticum, there were far more in ancient times than what we have now. So we only have a small amount of Hermetic documents. And you'll notice that when you look at the Hermetic documents that we have, there are no vowel chants. Whereas when you go to the Nag Hammadi writings, which haven't been touched by anyone, they were basically buried there by monks when the monks were told to destroy all their Gnostic writings. We find a couple of Hermetic texts that have these words of power and vowel chants. And my gut feeling, and I can't prove this, my gut feeling has been that the heresiologists, the early church fathers, went through the Hermetic writings, destroyed anything that had magical elements, which means the vowel chants, and just left the ordinary writings. And so here we have a couple of examples in the Nag Hammadi writings. We have the words of power. So I think that the early church just didn't want us practicing ancient magic. And that to me is one of the coolest thing about the Nag Hammadi writings, that we actually have writings that were available to the elite in ancient times. That's just my feeling, and I can't point to any academic who said the same thing.
I think Bentley Layton says that as a summary, that these vows mean God is the beginning and the end. There's an alpha and there's an omega there, of course. But again, as I say, it's for me, it just reminds me of it looks like a trance, like somebody's in trance, proclaiming these just words of power. I mean, vows of power. I mean, it says it all, doesn't it? And as you say, it could be true, because these are one of the few examples that have survived.
I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out to refer to the Alpha and Omega, because that concept occurs in the Book of Revelation. But the thing is, you're only looking at 2 of the vowel sounds, whereas there are 7 all up. So Alpha normally refers to the lunar sphere, and Omega refers to the sphere of Saturn. But you've got all the other planetary spheres in between. So whenever I see vowel chants, I think in terms of calling in planetary energies.
Astrology, basically, you would say. Early astrology.
Well, astrology is more a way of sitting back and watching things happening in the heavens. This is applying astrological practices, for want of a better word, and using them magically. So a magician wouldn't just sit back and be a prisoner to his fate. A magician would actually change their fate. And there's a particular invocation, the PGM, where the magician wants to actively change his astrological fate. He's not happy with the fate that he has. He wants to change it. So if you don't like the position of planets that you had and all the planetary influences that you have on your life when you were born, you can change that to something more favorable. And that's the thing with magic. It's very proactive. It's very active. You can change things rather than, because astrology is more about studying what's happening in the heavens, observing how things in the heavens affect what happens on Earth. Whereas with magic, you actually pick up your wand or whatever, I'm saying that metaphorically, and change things around you.
Right. Yeah, no, of course, makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, it's one of the most baffling gospels, to be honest with you. So yeah, very interesting, and thank you very much for your impressions on it, because that's been very interesting. Thank you.
Look, I'm very interested in the stuff that you're doing. I see a lot of truth, a lot of useful things in Gnosticism, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you on the show to introduce these concepts to the listening audience. So it's not just me who likes this stuff. There are other people out there who are into it and who are writing about it. So the next thing I wanted to ask you is, you briefly alluded to Mary Magdalene, and she gets mentioned in a number of Gnostic texts. So when you combine all the information in those Gnostic texts, what conclusion do you come to as to her significance to Jesus and to early Christianity?
Well, Mary Magdalene, of course, is fantastic, a fantastic figure in mainstream Christianity, and the Orthodox see her in one way, the Catholics see her in a different way. But in Gnosticism, if we assume, and again, we have to assume, because there's scholars fighting over this, that this is the Mary that's referred to in the Gospel of Mary, which is part of the Nag Hammadi codices. She is, of course, and again, it's a bit of a cliche to say, but yes, she is the sacred feminine. She's also the gospel really is. It's all about how Peter and the other disciples are very angry that she's the special disciple of Christ. She's the one who's closest to Christ, and that's a fascinating idea, and it's something to people talk about patriarchal society. I mean, that was the height of patriarchal society, when women were they were not even considered human beings in that period. So to have a woman in a gospel at that level is I think something quite unusual and great as well. And of course, this is where I think you get all these ideas of the Da Vinci Code, and the fact that that Mary Magdalene was was Christ's partner, and then that she when she went to France, you find this in this book, in this medieval book, The Golden Rule, I think it's called, where she goes to France, and then there's a whole lineage of descendants of Christ. But of course, that's a digression, really. I mean, I think the significance is that if this is really Mary Magdalene, and I think that it's fair to say that she is in the Gospel of Mary. I think it's hugely important. It shows us that women were on equal terms, or not even on equal terms. I mean, she was more important than any of the men. It's I think it's completely groundbreaking if we take the historical context. And then, of course, we've got the way she's perceived in mainstream religion, which is the prostitute, and then yes, and all this. So this is a really she has a very, very important role in the Gospel of Mary and in Gnosticism, and she does symbolize Gnosticism. She does symbolize because it all starts with Sophia, who's wisdom, who begets this false god, and then you've got Lilith, and you've got all these other female Gnostic figures. And I think that a bit like the Gospel of Thomas, that's you know, a Gnostic gospel in its own right, not Gnostic in the Gnostic tradition, but Gnostic in its own right, presenting us with its own version of Gnosticism. I think Mary Magdalene is halfway between the Orthodox mainstream Christian. She's known within the literature of the biblical literature of the of mainstream Christianity, but also she's now in this. She's got this really important role in Gnosticism. So I think she's it's a great figure. It's somebody that can be easily identified. Everybody knows, and the fact that she's the #1 disciple is, I think, very interesting.
Yeah, like you said, she understood Jesus' message better than any of the other apostles. And it's also stated that Jesus would greet her by kissing her on the lips. It doesn't say whether it was a quick peck or there was any tongue action. So,
no, that's right. I mean,
so
in those times, sorry to interrupt, I think in that period as well, kisses were a sign of affection, and not necessarily sexual, but it could be, of course, perfectly, we don't know that. It could also be symbolic, where that's how what it means that Christ was communicating that Gnostic knowledge, and that could be just a figure of some sort of metaphor for that communication of Gnostic knowledge. There's many ways of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, Peter came from a very patriarchal background, and he was jealous of the relationship that Jesus had with Mary Magdalene, and he actively suppressed, and he was probably actively involved in slandering her as an adulteress, a prostitute, or what have you. But I think if it hadn't been for Peter, we would have a very different Christianity. You'd have a Christianity where we'd have female priests on an equal footing with male priests. We'd have a much more balanced Christianity. We wouldn't
Definitely
have the sort of thing that we have now. Anyway, so moving right along, many years ago, I read an interview in the OC Weekly, which is a magazine that we have here in Orange County, and it was with Marvin Meyer. And he stated that after he translated the Gospel of Judas, he had a Christian woman confront him on the street, telling him that he'd burn in hell for translating it. Why do you think the translation generated so much controversy?
It ruins the story, doesn't it? It ruins the canonical story. That's the real, that's at the crux of it, really. It's the mainstream Christianity needs, and the canonic, the New Testament, the Gospels, they do need to have clear-cut characters. And I think in the term, so you've got Judas who betrays Christ and then commits suicide on the field of blood. That's the canonical version of it. In the Gospel of Judas, you've got the intimation that Judas is actually doing this following the instructions of Christ. So that, of course, upsets the whole narrative, because then there isn't a figure of evil, somebody that hasn't managed to transcend sin. There's and that can be blamed for this. So I think that's probably one of the main reasons. I think that it does, just like many other Gnostic Gospels, where the crucifixion is seen as something symbolic and not literal. All these things compromise the canonical theory or the vision perspective that mainstream Christianity has. I think that's one of the main reasons. But I think April DeConnick says that her view on Judas is that he is really evil. And she bases it on the same gospel. So this is the other thing with Gnosticism, of course, that it's being non-dogmatic, and of course, like I suppose, like many canonical gospels, it's open to interpretation. As a Coptic monk once said in an interview I watched, that the Bible and even the Gnostic Gospels, they're like you could read it as poetry. Because poetry is always open to interpretation, and there won't be two people reading the exact same meaning. when they read the poem. So I think it's the same sort of thing. But yeah, I would say that's why that person, that's why Mayor was probably you know, verbally assaulted by translating the Gospel of Judas. What do you think? Do you think there's more to it?
The fact is, Judas had an integral role. The thing is that the central message of Christianity is that Jesus died on the cross for all of our sins. He had to die on the cross. So you had to take him from his ministry to having him die on the cross, and Judas played an integral role in that. So whether he did that as a result of being evil and hating him and betraying him, or whether he did it because he knew that Jesus had to die and he understood his message better than anyone except Mary Magdalene, is up to conjecture. And as you pointed out, with Gnosticism, there is no central dogma, and you can flip things either way. Both interpretations are valid, but whichever way you slice it, you needed Judas to betray Jesus for him to die on the cross. You know,
Yeah.
Without that, there would have been no point to Jesus having lived. So Judas has a central role. It just comes down to what was motivating him, whether he was motivated by pure evil or whether he was motivated by a gnosis, a knowledge of what Jesus had to do.
Was he an agent of Yaldabaoth, which I think is what, or the DemiUrge, which is what April Deconic intimates, or was he actually doing his duty according to Mervyn Mayer, which, you know, say, right, this is the way things have to go, and I'm an actor in this, and I have to play my part. Yeah, absolutely. That's open to conjecture, as you say.
Yeah. So in your book, you cover a number of Gnostic teachers. Is there one in particular who you resonate with, and why?
I'd say that the author of the Gospel of Thomas would be very interesting. I would, if I knew who that was. I find Basilides very interesting because of his very magical approach. You know, and again, within this frame of Christianity, you know, in a way, he was self-defined as a Christian. But of course, he had this like Pythagoras. He had I think he's this people that wanted to join his group and be his students had to spend quite a long time in silence before they could be accepted, and it very much reminds me of you know, sort of like there's something of the ancient mysteries in this approach, and the theurgy and the and of course, this intriguing figure of Abraxas, which I believe has something to do with the days of the year, the number of the days of the year. But then, you know, this figure with snakes for legs and a cockerel's head and a sword and a shield, and you know, it seems to be a very very interesting. So it's and of course not much is known, and I believe there's nothing directly written by him that we can, or there's nothing at length that there's not much known of Basilides. So I quite like Basilides. I do like Valentinus because his dualism is more moderate than other Gnostic teachers. But yeah, I would say Basilides, I find him very interesting and intriguing, very intriguing, very intriguing. This Egyptian magic that he seems to have incorporated, but also with this philosophical school approach, it seems also almost proto-Masonic to me. You know, with these, you know, you've got to be in silence, and then, you know, almost as if there were great degrees and you know, stages where you could acquire that knowledge. So yeah, that's Basilides, I would say.
Okay. You mentioned Abraxas, who, as you pointed out, had the head of a rooster, the torso of a Roman centurion, and the legs of snakes. The thing is that when you look at his name, there are 7 letters. So you've got each of the 7 Greek vowels covered. And if you add up the value of each of those letters using isopsophy, which is, you know, the Greek version of gematria, they add up to 365.
Yeah, that's right.
So you've got the 7 planets and the year in the same name. in the PGM, they have an entity that they refer to as Abrasax. And I've wondered whether there's a difference between Abraxas and Abrasax, because it's just two of the letters are interchanged. I'm inclined to think it's the same entity. And again, you've got the same 7 letters, and it all adds up to 365. So
yeah, and also another interesting thing about Abraxas is that there is apparently a ring that has been recovered, or I'm not sure if it's an urban myth, but there's a ring that was worn by one of the masters of the Knights Templar, which features Abraxas on it, which of course is not impossible to believe that's the case, because they could have easily found all these different jewelry and cultural artifacts when they were in Jerusalem. But and I've always wondered if the Baphomet that the Knight Templars were accused of worshipping has anything to do with this Abraxas ring that one of their masters was apparently one of their grandmasters. I'll have to look into it with more detail, but it's a ring that's got the figure of Abraxas, and on the sides I think it's got one of the somebody's engraved on it, one of the Templar mottos, one of these Soldiers of Christ or Temple of Christ, something like that. So yeah, I've always wondered that Baphomet and Abraxas, do they have some sort of link? It's always surprised me.
well, what an interesting idea. I've never thought about there being some sort of connection between the two of them. So you're giving me some homework, something to look into, which is really cool. In your book, you provide a detailed survey of movements throughout history inspired by Gnosticism. I was wondering, what do you see as the future of Gnosticism, and how will it blend in with an ever-changing society and rapid technological development?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, if we take, people, if we forget that most people are not don't know what Gnosticism is, and probably won't be interested in Gnosticism. It's a very niche subject. It's a topic that not many people, are interested in. If you're talking, but if you look at the Gnostic ideas taken to the extremes of that dualism, where basically the physical world is an illusion. Now, quantum physics is not saying that exactly, but it's giving us an idea that, that the physical world is not as what we believe a few decades ago or centuries ago. It's no longer that tangible. It's not longer, nothing is as firm. Those beliefs are not, so, and then you've got the theory of simulation, for example, it's a thought experiment by Nick Bostrom, which I talk about in the book, where he, and again, it's a thought experiment, so it's not something to take literal, but he kind of demonstrates, quote unquote, that there's a 20% chance statistically that we're living in a simulation created by another civilization in the future or whatever, a highly sophisticated, high definition, a little bit like what we were talking about before with the Matrix. And I think that if we take the idea that only the mind matters, only consciousness matters, and everything physical doesn't, well, we've how long until people can download their lives onto the cloud and transcend physical mortality, for example? If we look at transhumanism, the transhumanists are trying to transcend the limitations of human physical body through technology and science. In a kind of what I call materialistic Gnosticism, which is an oxymoron and doesn't make any sense. But I think you see what I'm trying to say. So I think that looking to the future, if this is all like a virtual, reality, that nothing is real, that the physical world is an illusion, well, we're back in Matrix territory, aren't we? Or in the theory of simulation, or in, as I say, people can download their whole lives onto the cloud and live forever, but live forever as consciousness. I mean, it sounds quite kind of wacky, but it's not impossible. And I think that these are at some point these are Gnostic ambitions, you know, which I think that's what you know, that's one of the main characteristics of Gnosticism. This exacerbated dualism between spirit and matter, the physical world and the spiritual world, conscience and the body.
Okay, we've gone way over the time. It's been a wonderful interview, and I would normally ask Susan to come in and ask a question, but I know that there's a question that she would be burning at this point to ask you. One of the things that she's been looking into is, you know, having heads frozen in order to be reanimated, you know, hundreds of years in the future when that technology exists. And you seem to be talking about a way of taking all your experiences and uploading them into a cloud and then downloading them again. How does that tie in with the sort of stuff that Susan's into? Susan, you should come on and ask this. I shouldn't be asking your question for you.
I think
That's funny.
is
Yeah.
this sorry, Susan, sorry.
Oh, no problem. I was just gonna jump in here. Like Tony's referring to the Alcor reanimation program, I guess, where like many years in the future, I'm thinking that it's gonna just be like a dream state where you go to sleep and you wake up and it's like poof, you're suddenly awake again. But I was talking about reanimation to Tony and different things like that. So yeah, so I just thought I would jump in.
But is this what Walt Disney is? Isn't Walt Disney? I remember that's. I don't know if it's an urban myth, but I remember. I'm sure a few years ago I remember reading something about that Walt Disney was frozen or cryogenically. Oh, can't pronounce it. But he was
cryogenically frozen. Yeah.
Is that true? Is that true?
I think he actually missed the boat by 1 year. I think
Okay.
Ted Williams may have been one of the more famous ones, which may have just kind of missed the cutoff on there. But no, I just think it's really fascinating, you know, to kind of listen to you guys talk and all these different things. So yeah, carrying on to what Tony was kind of saying, but yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's yeah. I mean, as I say, I don't know if that will ever happen, but who knows if all our emotions and all our life experiences and well, our soul, our brain, our mind, our consciousness, our individuality can be downloaded. I mean, it's a bit like in artificial intelligence. There was an application in I think 2008, and I can't remember the name. I'm just getting old now, but it's a real application where you the lady that created it had a very good friend, and she said, and when he died, she was extremely heartbroken about this. So she used she had access to all his social platforms. So she went into his Facebook, emails, text messages, and she then created a virtual, you know, something like Alexa in Amazon, you know, in Amazon, something like that, but that could actually, with the same voice as he had, and all his, and obviously that was not him, but it sounded like him because the program, the software, was all made of his words, things that he'd actually said, and it was very clever how it could put them out. And then unfortunately, I think what happened is it became very popular, this application, and I can't remember the name of it. And people were getting too involved with these because they could actually choose their the accent, the background. I want him to be a Scottish civil engineer, for example, and that's what he would be, you know. And people would then get too deep into this, and the application was banned in Italy. So then the creators of the program, this lady, had to change it, and when they changed it, the people will go in. You could go to Reddit, this website, and there was loads of psychologists saying, "Has anybody heard of this application? It has been recently changed, and now I have loads of patients that are like heartbroken and with raised suicidal tendencies because, of course, from being that almost perfect virtual 24/7 artificial intelligent friend, they toned it down and it became like a sat nav sort of thing. So yeah, all these things. We're living in very interesting times, and lots of crazy stuff can happen. You know, yeah.
Okay, so what current projects are you engaging in, and how can people contact you to learn more about you?
So I'm very bad at having websites. Anybody who wants to contact me, they can just join me on Facebook or Instagram. I'm afraid that's yeah, I'm that age, so you know, those are the things I've got. And then of course I'm not writing anything at present, but I think that the next project should be about Hermeticism. Is the next I think a next progression from Gnosticism for me would be Hermeticism. So I'm thinking of I've just got the title in my mind, The Journey into Hermeticism. But that's going to be a lot of hard work. I'm going to have to really get into the Corpus Hermeticum, and you know, Marsilio Ficino and the Renaissance, and touches upon John Dee as well, I suppose, in a way, and Freemasonry and alchemy, and so yeah, that's a long-term project I haven't even started, but I hope to do this.
Well, maybe when that's finally completed, we can have you back on the show to.
That'll be
talk
lovely.
about it.
That'll be fantastic.
I'd love to review it and have you back on the show. It'd be, yeah, I think it'd be a wonderful
Thank
show.
you, Tony. Thank you very much.
So, Darren, thank you so much for coming on the show and letting us get to know you a little bit better. Susan and I wish you success with all your future endeavors, and have a good night.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.